All right. So, if you grew up collecting cards in the 80s and 90s, you know that the original iconic card of that era was not the 1989 Upper Deck Ken Griffey Jr. Yes, that card changed the hobby, and to this day, it's the most graded PSA card in history. Griffey was talented, he was charismatic, and Upper Deck's superior card stock forever changed the trajectory of sports cards. But no, the Griffey was not the first. There was something earlier. Nor was it the 1980 Topps Rickey Henderson. The 1980s were the era of Reagan. And during the 80s, Henderson was incorrectly viewed as arrogant and disrespectful. He went from Oakland to New York, to Oakland to Toronto. It wasn't until his insane career, which spanned from the late 70s to the early 2000s, parts of 4 decades, finally concluded that we began to appreciate Rickey as one of the greatest offensive baseball players in history. The original iconic card of the 80s, the card that set the hobby on fire, was neither the 89 Griffey nor the 80s Topps Henderson. It was the 1984 Donruss Don Mattingly rookie. No matter how many lawns you mowed, no matter how many hours you spent bagging groceries, if you were a kid in the 80s or the early 90s, this card was out of your league. Well, finally, last week, decades after I first laid eyes on that card in Beckett Monthly, I got one. I am now the owner of an 84 Donruss Mattingly. And who am I? I'm Dave Schwartz. On Instagram, I'm Iowa Dave. And you're listening to The Shallow End. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of The Shallow End, a podcast for serious collectors on a realistic budget. I'm Dave, and I'm grateful that you're tuning in. Let's get started. You know, I brought up the Mattingly in the open, and we'll definitely come back to that. And since this is the first episode, I'll talk about myself and what you can expect from me, my PC, how I collect, what I collect. We'll get to all that later. What I want to do first is talk a little bit about the title of this podcast, The Shallow End, and where it comes from. So think about it this way. I'm an adult. A lot of you listening, probably most of you listening, are adults. And you know what happens when you go into the shallow end of a pool when you're an adult. Not much can really happen. If you fall down, you skin your knee, you feel embarrassed, you stand back up, and the consequences are pretty low. The chances of you drowning are slim, or of getting hurt, nothing's really going to happen, right? That's kind of where I operate in the hobby, and that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. That's the space that I feel most comfortable. Low stakes, low consequences. It doesn't mean I don't love this hobby. I do. I'm incredibly passionate about it, just like you are. It just so happens that I'm very serious about building a collection that speaks to me on some level that doesn't require 4 and 5 and 6-figure cards. It's just not going to happen. Do I ever buy cards that tank? Yeah. And if they do, then it's no big deal. It doesn't affect me financially in the long term. That's deliberate. And I like to think that a lot of you are in the same boat, not because we necessarily want to be, but because we have to be, right? We have responsibilities. We have mortgages, jobs, partners, children, rent, everything else. That's all things that we need to think about. And it's so easy. It is so easy to get FOMO. I think FOMO and impatience, at least for me, are two of the most dangerous things in the hobby. They're the obstacles that I have to overcome. Social media, Instagram, it shows you what you don't have. It shows you what is possible, and it doesn't always tell you what is realistic. Well, what's realistic, at least for me, is that I need to operate within a budget. I will come back to that in just a little bit without dwelling on it too long. So let's get back to this Mattingly. Well, it's a PSA 7. Let's get that out of the way. I prefer graded cards. I like the way they fit. I think they fit nicely. I want to preserve it for all time. But just because I have to go on the more affordable side, it doesn't mean that I want to sacrifice appearance. It doesn't mean that I want to sacrifice quality. And so I've been looking for this card I joked that I was looking for it for decades, and that's not necessarily true. My tale is no different from many of yours. I collected as a kid. I grew up. I got a car. I got jobs. I got distracted, and then the pandemic hit. I went home to help my dad with some things. I went through my closet. I found about 30 or 40,000 cards that I had as a kid. I sold most of them off, kept a few, had a few graded, sold those, and next thing you know, I was back into the hobby. Well, I could never get the Mattingly off the brain. But whenever I looked at it, the cost was still exorbitant, right? I'm attracted to PSA 10s. I'm attracted to PSA 9s, but those are not always realistic. A PSA 10 of this Mattingly, even though it came out 39 years later, even though that Don Mattingly's health, his back went south on him, he's not even a Hall of Famer. He's been a manager multiple times. He hasn't won a World Series as a manager. There's no evidence that he's ever going to be immortalized. And yet his card, that 1984 Don Russ, continues to hold currency in the hobby. And I want it. I've always wanted it. So I began looking. Well, the asking price for those PSA 10s is somewhere in the four-figure range, anywhere from, $1,800 up to about $2,800. That's insane. That is an insane amount of money for a player who is never going to be in Cooperstown. The 9s, probably anywhere from about $180 to $220 if you catch an auction on a good day, up to $350 for a really nice centered copy. That should probably be a 10. One of those cards that you look at and you can't figure out what's wrong with it. And the 8s just sucked. They were all off center, either left to right or top to bottom. There's something about an 8 I just don't like. I don't have a lot of 10s. 9s are kind of the sweet spot, sometimes depending on the card. But if it comes down to an 8 or a 7, I'm more inclined to go for the 7 because I don't know. I don't know what it is about the 8s, but they just don't sit right with me. And wouldn't you know it, I came across a 7 that I looked at, and I thought, how is this not a 10? Now that is, I realize, kind of an asinine statement. For something to be a 7 and not a 10, there's probably surface issues, perhaps something on the edges, but the corners look good, and the centering was amazing. And I realized that it was being sold on eBay by Victory Investments. And so I messaged Sean on Instagram and asked him about the card, and he said it was just a beautiful card as far as 7s go. And listen, this is someone in the hobby who's proved himself time and time again to be trustworthy. And so I was having Venmo issues at the time. Like I said, I got to be realistic, right? And so off I went to eBay, bought it off, and it arrived. It arrived about, 4 or 5 days later. Sean shipped it quickly, and I've got it. I got to tell you, this thing came. I rushed to the mailbox when I got home. I ripped it open. You'd think that it was Christmas morning, right? I mean, this was a card. This was a card that almost 4 decades ago was new, and by the time I was really absorbed in the hobby the first time, man, you would see it. You would see it in Beckett. You would see it in some of those old card shops where the owners were probably just majorly screwing over the kids, selling us things that were off-centered, that were miscut with bent corners. We didn't know any better. We were just profit to them. And I look in the case and I would just sort of drool for this card, and I opened it and there it was. And man, when I opened this card earlier this week, it was just everything that I hoped it would be. I mean, think about that feeling. Close your eyes and imagine that feeling, that time that a card came in the mail, and it was so much more than just another slab to slide into your Zion case or into some other sort of a collection box. That it was this card that means so much more. And I just had decades of history and memories just flooding in when I looked at this. And I don't know if I've ever held one in my hand before that point. But now here I was in my home holding this card that once was unattainable and now was part of my collection. It was absolutely, completely a moment to savor. And it didn't matter that it cost about $60. It didn't matter that I actually had to sell a couple of cards just to be able to not afford it, because I can afford it, but to be sensible about it, right? For me, collecting is almost a zero-sum game. Here's where I stand in the hobby, right? I have a career, I have a job, I contribute to the household. My partner, my wife, is in a profession in which she earns considerably more than me. If I lost my job, we would have to cut costs, we would have to adjust, and some things would have to change. But we'd stay in the house. If she lost her job, we would have to sell the house. We would have to move to an apartment. Our life would be radically different. There is nothing in our relationship that I respect more than the burden and the responsibilities that are on her and her career. And so I do not dip into our savings. I do not dip into our checking. I do none of that. I am a completely self-sustained hobbyist. That will be a story for another episode. But there's nothing I respect more than what she has to carry. It is an enormous weight on her shoulders, and there was nothing that I would do to press down on that weight to increase that burden. And so, yeah, was the card $60? It was. And so I sold off a couple of cards that came to a total of about $45 or $50, put an extra $10 into it. I think there was free shipping. Thanks, Sean. And I have the card. And now my collection is to a place that I never would have imagined. If you would have told child me that I would be owning this card, I would think that I would be the coolest kid on the playground, that we'd come back to my house after school, drink some Capri Suns, right? Bust open a couple of Lunchables, pop Excitebike into the Nintendo Entertainment System, and then maybe if you were nice, maybe if I was in a good mood, I would let you hold the Mattingly. Anyway, enough about the stupid Mattingly. Let's get to some broader topics here. What do I collect? What's in my PC? Well, clearly it's baseball. My sweet spot is about 1980 through 2018, but I also will collect some ultra-modern, and I will collect some vintage as well. I dabble in basketball, maybe a little bit of football, and I also like to collect cards that remind me of certain moments in my life, certain points in my professional life. Things that happened growing up, athletes who I found especially impressive, who did things that I've never seen anybody else do. I have a Usain Bolt card coming in right now from the United Kingdom, an Olympic card that was made in 2012. I've never seen anybody not just run and win, but dominate like that in the 100 and the 200 meters. I have a bit of a track background. My kids are into track, and so that's a card that really spoke to me. Those are the things that I really care about. Guests, the guests that I intend to have on here will talk about their collections, and I hope that you will find them lending a unique perspective on the hobby as well. Maybe they're into some sort of a chase that they're having trouble acquiring, not because of the financial cost of it, but because it's just something that's hard to find. Maybe something is so low valued that in the past nobody even thought to keep it, and so trying to acquire it is next to impossible. There's just so much out there, so many stories that we can tell, and I'm really excited to bring those to you. I'm really excited to be a part of this network. I'm excited to expand my place in this hobby and to dive deeper into it, because for me, it just can't be a matter of see card, buy card, see card, buy card. I think that would get old pretty quick. I run the website hobbycontent.com, and once a week on there I do an old school print style Q&A. I love it. Sometimes you're laying there in bed at night, and if you have clumsy thumbs like me, or you're scrolling Instagram, but next thing you know, you turn the sound on, and then you're waking up your partner, and you're like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. That's one reason I'm doing the Q&A. Is Q&A is something that you can read at night, and it's got no sound, and you can just scroll and absorb yourself into the hobby. Anyway, I'm rambling. And if I'm rambling, that means it's time to end this introductory episode. Thank you for hanging in with me. I look forward to talking with you again next week. Any feedback that you have would be most welcome. My Instagram, again, is @Iowa_Dave, and I'm here for you. I'm here to talk with you. I'm here to listen. Take care. Have a great week, and I'll be back soon. Thanks to Black Box for their song Legendary. Black Box, play us out.